And welcome to this week's episode of Broadcaster Hour. I'm Roger Hoover. We've got Kyle Crooks on the far side of the screen, and today in the center of the screen, we welcome in not only one of my mentors, one of my teammates on the Crimson Tide Sports Network, he is the longtime voice of Alabama football, Mr. Eli Gold. Eli, it's great to see you. How's everything going?
I am well. Good to see both of you gentlemen. Hope everybody's healthy and well and wise and so on. And just like everybody, I guess we're just counting down the days until, Lord willing, something is played somewhere.
Yeah, normally around this time of the year, you're getting ready to start heading to Tuscaloosa for some practices and get all the preseason preparations ready for a full season of Alabama football. But just during this time, how have you been able to stay busy and also keep your mind sharp, knowing that we are going to have football at some point, hopefully?
Well, I don't know how sharp my mind is, but, I'm just keeping up with everything. I've got a list of press releases right here. This is for, Dylan Moses and Surtain going into the Bednarik Award watch list and all sorts of stuff. So I'm keeping up, obviously, with all that goes on. But, it's just there is a degree of tedium here. You read a lot, you watch TV, my wife and I are blessed to have a small place at the lake, so we've been spending some time out there. But I did do a couple of shows with Nick Saban last week. Part of his responsibilities during the off season is to make appearances normally in person at luncheons and dinners. And he and I have gotten to the point where I'll travel with him a good bit, and we'll do what we call a town hall discussion. He has gotten tired over the years of standing up at the podium, making a speech, answering questions, and be done. That had just gotten a little stale for him. So a couple of years ago, he made the suggestion, what if you and I, talking to me, he said, what if you and I just sit up on the stage like two guys at a bar and shoot the breeze about whatever? Football, yes. Life, yes. Golf, yes. Whatever it might be. And I said, sure, man. I said, you're the star here. I said, whatever you want to do is fine with me. So we have been doing those town hall meeting style things. Well, two of them that we do each summer are for our bigger sponsors. One is Golden Flake Snack Foods, now in their 63rd year with the university as a sponsor. And they, because of their seniority and because of their generosity, they have earned a luncheon with Nick Saban every summer. It's usually done on a Tuesday afternoon prior to the media days or something like that. And then the Crimson Tide Sports Network, our parent company, has a dinner for our larger sponsors. And those people who have, again, earned the right to attend this dinner, Coach Saban and I are there, and we do our deal on the stage. Well, we had those a week or so ago, but again, they weren't in person. There was no sit-down dinner. There was no lunch buffet. There was nothing. It was just done on Zoom. But those are some of the responsibilities that he and I have during the summer months. So we did those a couple of weeks ago, and they went very well. He was in a very good mood, but I was here in my office, and he was in his office, and we had, 600 people or whatever it was on the Zoom deal. So I've been doing some of those items. I've been doing a few other things for the alumni folks, but otherwise it's been a lot of sitting around and reading and just waiting for the season to get here.
Eli, how has your relationship grown with Coach Saban throughout the years?
It's grown exponentially. It really has. We've always gotten along. Let's start with that, Kyle. We've gotten along well. He is different in that he and I deal with each other when we need to. We get along wonderfully. We get along great. But he knows that sitting around and talking to old Eli for an hour and a half is not going to help Alabama win football games. Conversely, every other coach with whom I have worked, dating back to Bill Curry, so that goes a long way back, we would, for instance, our pregame radio show, we would always tape that on Friday, whether it was in the hotel, whether it was in their office, whether it was at their home, whatever it might have been. And we would sit around, my wife and daughter would show up with me, and we'd all sit around, we'd shoot the breeze for a long time, just general stuff, and then, all right, let's turn the machine on. We'd turn on the tape recorder in those days. Now it's an MP3 player or an iPhone, but in those days, a little tape recorder. We would tape the show, and then when we finished the show, we'd kick back and sit around again for another half hour. One night, Gene Stallings and I we were both building homes at the same time. He told me to bring my blueprints to Columbus, Mississippi, where we stayed before the game in Starkville. And he said, hey, let's compare blueprints. Let's look. Now, of course, his house looked like the Marriott, and mine looked like a little outlier building in the backyard. But we were sitting there going over blueprints. He goes, now you see, you need to put an electric outlet right here, he'd say to me, because so we would all, Mike Shula and I, we would talk. I would talk with him about stuff I never talked with anybody. Religion. He was a religious man, and we would talk religion. We would talk NASCAR. We would talk all sorts of stuff. Nick Saban, we taped that show 2 hours before kickoff. And I mean 2 hours. When we play on CBS and the kickoff is at 2:37 Central Time or 3:37 Eastern, well, he and I don't meet at 12:30. We meet at 12:37. He's not there at 12:30. We do the show, and for those 15 minutes, I have his undivided attention. But as soon as I'm done, he's out the door on to whatever he's doing next. We are very cordial. We get along wonderfully. Like I say, we have a great relationship, but we just don't, sit around and shoot the breeze. When I show up to practice during the week, sometimes he'll acknowledge me. Sometimes he won't. Sometimes he'll just give me one of these, like, how are you? Sometimes not even that. And I found out that, I had to ask. The very first year when he was with us, we didn't talk much at all. We really didn't. And I thought I had ticked him off. So I called Jim Hawthorne, who at the time was the voice of the LSU Tigers, and Jim had worked with Coach Saban. And I said, Jim, I think I ticked him off. He said, let me tell you, he said, I worked with the man for 4 years and change. He goes, we never had a conversation. And I said, really? He said, yeah, he's just not given to talking much. And now, of course, we do talk, and he'll always take my phone call if necessary. I don't abuse that right, but, I do have total access, myself and all of my color men over the years, Kenny Stabler, Phil Savage, now John Parker Wilson. We can go to practice, obviously, start to finish. We can go into the locker room. We can watch tapes. We can do anything that we want. But we have a good, respectful business relationship. But, he knows that he can throw barbs at me. He'll take a couple of shots at me, well-meaning. And he'll also know that I'll take a couple of barbs at him. Nothing huge, but I can make fun of his golf game a little bit because I know he's ready to come back at me with some responses. So we get along just fine, Kyle.
And I'm sure in a way he's made you a better broadcaster, maybe a better interviewer, knowing how maybe strict he is with the questions that are going to be asked. And you talk to him for a full coach's show or for that 5-minute period in the pregame. It can be an intimidating setting, but I'm sure he, in a way, gets the best out of you, doesn't he?
Yeah, he makes me prepare a bit more. With all the other coaches, I would just turn on the tape recorder. And my next question would oftentimes be predicated upon their previous answer. Now, clearly, there are always some things you have to talk about, whatever the game, whatever that week's news was. You'd always cover that. But oftentimes, the coach would say something, and I would say in my mind, I said, "Well, that's pretty good." I said, "I'll just follow up on that." With Coach Saban, I actually sit in the press box before I go down to the locker room. And because I host the 1 hour show with him, or the 90-minute show with him on Thursday nights, I have already spoken with him extensively just a day and a half prior. But I will write down on a business card questions that I want to ask him. I don't use that card when I'm in with him, but I just want to make sure that in my mind, I know what to ask. I have learned over the years that he hates to compare. You don't want to use that C word. I asked him very early in our tenure, I said, and it was a comparison, not so much of talent level, but it was a comparison of styles, talking about Eddie Lacy and Mark Ingram and Trent Richardson and so on, all great running backs. But I had, compare, for me, what the fans are going to see and yada, yada, yada. Well, he looked at me. He gave me one of those glares. It felt like somebody had come up behind me with a hypodermic needle full of ice water and shoved it into my spine. I just knew that I had done something wrong, but I wasn't quite sure what it was. He gave me a so-so answer. Show was over. And normally he's already up and out the door by the time I'm doing our outro. I have a live read for a sponsor and then a commercial cue and yada, yada. This time he sat there. And I'm saying to myself, uh-oh. And he looked at me and he said, "That was a stupid question." And I started answering him back. I said, "Well, Coach, I didn't think it was." And then I stopped, realizing I was not going to win that discussion. And he said, "I will not. I hate comparing people." He said, "Because if I say something good about player A, and if I don't say the same thing about player B, people are automatically going to think that I like A better than B, or that B can't do what A did, or C is not as good as this." He said, "I just don't do so." And since then, I've never asked him to compare. And in instances when I've had to do a comparison, we were in Arkansas, and we were playing the Razorbacks, and they had Gerald Sprinkle, that big tight end that they had there. And Brett Bielema used him as a receiver. He was very, very good. Previously, Bama had played Ole Miss, and they had Evan Ingram, the great tight end there. And Bama had trouble stopping Evan Ingram. They just couldn't control him. I needed, in this pregame show, I needed to compare, for substance purpose, I needed to compare Gerald Sprinkle with Evan Ingram without using the C word, without saying compare. So what I did was I said, "Coach," I said, "let's talk about the tight ends." I said, Brett Bielema uses, has a way of using Gerald Sprinkle. And Hugh Freeze, at the time, who was coaching at Ole Miss, said he has a way of using Evan Ingram, who had a pretty good day against Alabama. How do you handle this tough tight end? And during the course of his answer, he compared, without using the C word, he compared how they use, at least not so much the ability of the players, but how the teams used their tight end. So I learned that. From the get-go. But otherwise now we have no problems. We get along fine, and everything is good.
Legendary figure in Nick Saban, and for you, you grew up surrounded by some legendary figures in New York, and they were mostly in your transistor radio. What was the spark for you for broadcasting and specifically listening to the radio?
I was a terrible student, had no interest in going to school. That was number one. I was a great first baseman playing softball and Little League in Brooklyn, New York. I really had a spectacular glove, but I couldn't hit very, very well. And of course, I was always larger than the average bear. So it became clear I was not going to be a world-class athlete of any type. So I said, how can I be part of the world of sports without being an athlete? I loved the games. I watched them. I was a super spectator. And of course, you got to remember in those days, it was a small TV screen on black and white, no cable. But I, sat there and watched everything I could. And and I love traveling. I always dreamed about going places and seeing this and seeing that. And it dawned on me that I could be a sports broadcaster. The first entree to sports for me was selling peanuts at Madison Square Garden. I couldn't afford to get in. We didn't have the money. My dad had passed away when I was very young. He died of cancer. And I said, well, if I can't afford to go in, what's the next best option? And that's for them to pay me to go in. So I'd sell peanuts at the Garden. And instead of standing down in the good seats where the rich people tended to give you a tip when you sold your product, I went up to the cheap seats. I went up to the blue seats and hung out near the press box to watch the broadcast. I was a real geek, man. I would stand there holding my basket full of peanuts, and I'd be staring into the press box. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I was just enthralled with watching these men read, watching somebody hand them a card and read the card, watching them talk to their analysts alongside. And then when these men came out to go to the bathroom or to get to the elevator or what have you, I descended upon them like a swarm of locusts with all sorts of questions. So that's what, I just had the interest. I loved sports. And I wanted to be a broadcaster. I just knew that's what and when I graduated from 8th grade, when I got out of 8th grade, we put out a little yearbook, and it had a space to write down, all sorts of stuff. And one of the things was future occupation. And in the 8th grade, I wrote down sports broadcaster. And, that was my sight. I set my sights. And then, as has well been documented, I did not spend a whole lot of time in school. I grew up in New York City where there were 77 radio stations. Things were different back in those days. So I spent time working at some of the greatest radio stations in America. I never got paid, but I was living at home. I had no expenses. I was a young kid. But I would be at WOR radio and WNEW and WCBS FM. I'd work at these stations, learn the business, then eventually get a job with the Mutual Broadcasting System. And then I became an audio engineer for a couple of networks. And I just met a lot of people. And then eventually one job leads to the next. And I was able to get hired on in the old Eastern Hockey League, which was the league about which the movie Slapshot was made. And that started me. I was terrible, man. I was awful. I was just terrible on the air. But it was a low impact broadcast. You probably couldn't have heard the station across the street from their stick. But I learned play by play, and then one job led to the next, to the next, to the next. But I loved Mel Allen growing up. I'd listen to him on the radio, my little transistor radio. And for you young kids out there, if you don't know what a transistor radio is, you can Google it. I would fall asleep with that little button in my ear listening to he and Red Barber do Yankee baseball. Then I'd fall asleep, and the next morning, of course, the batteries were dead. You had to replace the batteries. But listening to him, listening to Bob Wolf, a great baseball, hockey, and basketball broadcaster, listening to Marv Albert in those days do the Rangers and the Knicks on WNBC, Radio 66. Not WNBC, WNBC, Radio 66 in New York. Those were the people who, Marty Glickman, who did the high school game of the week on Channel 11 television. and I didn't have much to do in high school. I wasn't a student at all. But when Marty came to Midwood High School to do the game of the week against Erasmus, I hung out with the TV crew. I was just eating up with it, Raj. I was just eating up with it, and I bet you remember some of those names, Kyle, that I just mentioned there.
Yeah.
And when you would be around some of these guys or listening to those broadcasts, Marty Glickman helped train Marv Albert, and you've mentioned before, Marv Albert was so good on the radio. I think a lot of the generations now know him just as being like the definitive television voice of basketball. But what were the fundamentals? Yeah, what made him so good on radio? What were some of the building blocks of play-by-play you learned from those guys?
That just because the game is going fast, you don't have to. I put that into great use in my 41 years with NASCAR. Just because the cars are going 200 miles an hour doesn't mean I have to. And people can't listen as quickly as we can talk. So I learned to slow down, even if I was a half a tick behind the action. The presentation was far more important than the speed. You start going fast, you start slurring your words, you start fumfering. I've noticed over the years, from way back when to where we are today, my delivery is far more deliberate now than it was when I was a kid, as I've learned to go. And the other thing is, you can never describe too much on radio. We are the eyes of the listener. I don't worry about the people who are watching on television. I know they're there, but I'm not broadcasting for them. I'm broadcasting for the people who cannot see the event. There's not anything worth it that you don't describe. If you get a whiff of popcorn coming through the air, you mention that. The lights are on, you mention that. It's not enough to say that it's a gray day. I'll say the pewter gray sky. Kevin Harlan, whose work I love, he happens to be a dear friend, but that has notwithstanding, I love his work. I've learned from him. For years, I would always say, quarterbacks in the shotgun gets the snap. Well, that was never enough for Kevin Harlan. Kevin would say, he'll get the snap belt high, chest high. He'll reach to his right to grab the snap. That's what radio is all about. It's a descriptive art. I'm not a commentator. I'm not an editorialist. I am a professional describer. That's what I tell people. I don't offer editorials or commentary on the air. I describe what I see. Why would I want to tell you what such and such is doing when I got Kenny Stabler sitting next to me, who's been there and done that? What right do I have to analyze something? So I am a professional describer. But as a result of that, you can never say too much as in a descriptive nature.
And the game nowadays, it's much more up-tempo. And I like what you said about trying to slow down over the years, because that's something that I consciously have tried to do and think about. But when the game's moving so fast and you have to get the formation in, how do you economize words, try to find ways where you're not talking into a snap or talking too fast prior to a snap?
Very simple. You throttle your color man. I'm being very serious. Many times, and Roger can tell you, he has sat in the booth many times. I'll reach out like this in front of John Parker or in front of Snake or Phil or whomever, not because what they're saying is not good, but because I need the time, and I'll just go quickly back to the line of scrimmage, 2 wides right, 2 wides left. Well, what did that take me? 3 seconds, and you're back to it again. So it's not that difficult, really. If you economize, well, maybe you economize in names, 2 wides to the right, 2 wides to the left, instead of saying, Jerry Jeudy and Henry Ruggs are wide to the right and Joe Blow and this guy are wide to the left. You can just describe what you're seeing, and the names will come as the play develops. So that's basically what I do, but the pacing is most important to me. I don't want to start going crazy speed-wise, and I think it takes from the broadcast.
How much memorization do you do of the opponent, of skill positions, of an entire defense? So does that in a way make it much easier for you to call the game more fluently if you have names and numbers down just like that?
Well, I do have names and numbers down to some degree, okay? I am not going to lie, I don't memorize every name and number. The primary players, yes. I mean, I know the primary guys. And of course, when I do the NFL, I'm lucky in that I love the NFL and I recognize so many of these players. You know, when I would do the Indianapolis Colts and there's a guy in the backfield with dreadlocks hanging out of the back of his helmet, you know, you don't need to see the number. It was Edgerrin James. You just knew who it was. And of course, as the game goes, you will memorize more and more of the numbers through repetition. But I have a wonderful spotter in Butch Owens, who has been with me now for the full 32 years. I have an extensive depth chart that I use, a spotting chart, as most guys do, with everything on it, so I'm not shuffling papers. And when I'm sitting there with my binoculars up, sometimes I can quickly peek down under the binoculars and double check myself, 33 for Utah State as whomever. You just do it, and the more you do it, the more adept at it you become. That's something you learn after all the years. But the basic names, the quarterback, the top runner or two, the premier wide receiver, the top tight end for the opponents, those names I've got. The second string right guard, when he comes in, well, there's time to look down and grab that name off the chart.
Yeah, you mentioned your depth chart. Could you hold up a copy of that to the camera so we can kind of see? And then as you kind of hold it up, what's important for you to have under every player's bio? You know, how many stats are you putting there for Mac Jones? Are you doing anything, storylines, anything like that?
Well, this is the chart for Alabama and Michigan. Okay, that's the game, the bowl game last year. I don't know how well you can see things here, but here's quarterback Mac Jones. Above it says 6'2", 205 RSSO. So he's a 6'2", 205-pound redshirt sophomore. It says Jacksonville, Florida. Then it says Bolles, Bolles in parentheses. That's his high school's name. And I have the same for every player. Then I have L is last game. The statistics right here. Last game, which would have been the Auburn game, 26 of 39, 66.7% efficiency, 335 yards passing, 4 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. And then underneath it, there's a category that says S, and that's the season statistics. So if he throws another touchdown against Michigan, well, I could look, he had 11 coming in for the year. So that's his 12th touchdown pass of the year. So it's right there in front of me. Then I have all sorts of biographical information that I will update throughout the course of the year. Some of it I don't update at all. Some I do. But it says 2019 Academic Excellence Award. 3 games started, 11 games played in 19. Career passing and rushing numbers coming in. All sorts of stuff. His career highs, his stuff in high school. 94, it says 94 TDP Waddle versus VULL. That's a 94-yard touchdown pass to Jalen Waddle against Louisiana Lafayette in 18. Second longest in Alabama history. I have 4 and a star. So he was a 4-star top 20 pro-style quarterback coming out of high school. Then I have written in, for instance, let me take somebody else here. Let's go to Najee Harris. Same basic thing here. Although you see in Najee's case, you have something in orange right here, and it says 2 SEC, which means he's on the second team All SEC as voted by the coaches for that season. But I will have number 1 in a circle down here. You probably can't see it. It's in pencil. It says 1 rush, 5.9 L31 LSU, which means he is the number 1 rusher on the ball club, averaging 5.9 yards a carry. L31 means his long rush was 31 yards against LSU. Same thing underneath that number. It says 5 in a circle. 5 REC, the number 5 receiver on the ball club. 11.3 L42 USM. He's averaging 11.3 yards per reception, a 42-yarder against Southern Mississippi. So I have all of these things for both teams, for whether it's for Alabama or for Michigan, and I do color code everything just because I do. Here's the Michigan chart for the same game, and whether it's Michigan or whether it's Alabama, you'll see some green highlighted splotches across the thing. That's anybody who's from the state of Alabama, just to reference it. So if the Michigan guy is making a play, Devin Gill, whatever it is, or whatever, anybody, you have it in front of you, so you don't have to start searching. Then, of course, I have stuff that you should know, but just in case you forget. Head coach Nick Saban. Then underneath that, I have Brian Baker, associate head coach. Jeff Banks, special teams. Scott Cochran, strength and conditioning. Charles Huff, associate head coach. Then underneath that, since this is the offense, I have Steve Sarkisian as the offensive coordinator. Jeff Banks, tight ends coach. Kyle Flood, O-line. Charles Huff, running backs. Holman Wiggins, wide receivers. So if I need to say something about a particular position coach, and if I don't want to start thinking about it, it's right there in front of me. Then I have the team comparison stats. This box right here is Bama offense, Michigan defense. And then the next chart, if this is the Alabama defense, would have Bama defense, Michigan offense. And on the Michigan charts, it's the same thing, Michigan offense against Alabama. And this way, it shows me exactly what the numbers are. First line is scoring. Alabama averaging 48.3 points per game. Michigan's defense giving up only 19.5. And then underneath it, in those little green boxes, it is, if it's in a green box, that means they're in the top 20 in the nation. It says, well, maybe you can see here, it says Bama offense, and underneath it, it says SEC, and then FBS. So it shows me immediately that Bama is first in the SEC in scoring and second in America. Then it shows me for Michigan, they are fifth defensively in scoring in the Big Ten, and they are 18th in America. And every category in defense and offense is there: scoring, rushing, passing, efficiency, and so on. I have the schedules with the scores of every game on every chart. I have the score by quarters down here at the bottom. So if that comes into conversation. And then a few little things that I do. Some of the numbers, like you'll see Evan Neal up here, right there. His number is pink. Well, it's a black number on a pink box. Anybody in a pink box is a true freshman. So you don't even have to look it up. You don't even have to look to see where he is or anything. If it's in a pink box, he's a true freshman. So things of that nature are on there. I have the punters here and the place kickers. And then down here I have the holder and the long snappers. Everything that I will need, hopefully, is on these charts, so I don't have to start, searching during the game. And then, of course, for the other team, I will also have in a contrasting color. For instance, up here, the defensive end, you'll see that I have his name written phonetically because I'm not familiar with him all that well. And his first name is Kwity, last name is Paye. I don't want to have to think about it, so it's pronounced Quitty Pay, and I just write that in phonetically, as I do for anybody whose name might be a little bit unusual. But again, the same thing for the other team. Here are the coaches, here's Harbaugh and all of his assistant coaches and the defensive coaches and so on. Here are all the comparison stats I talked about. Bama's offense, Michigan defense. So during a game, I'll have the Alabama offensive chart here, the other team's defensive chart here. Then I'll flip them over when the ball changes hands, and it's still offense and defense, but it'll be Michigan's offense and the Bama defense. So, but I mean, I have everything, even in Michigan's case, when they played a team that was nationally ranked. Not only do they have the game and the score and the date and all that, but I write in number 13. So Wisconsin was 13th in the nation the day they played them. Then down here, 14 is Iowa. They were 14th, Iowa was, the day they played them, and so on. So I can look quickly and say, well, they've played 6 teams that are nationally ranked coming into the ball game today. So that's what I basically have. It's a long week of preparation, but it pays off come Saturday.
Certainly does, and we appreciate you showing us those charts.
I send it to a guy who puts it into that nice, neat format for me. Then he ships it to my FedEx office location here in Birmingham. I go down and pick it up. But so that's the procedure. But I'll start on that on Monday, and wait for the national rankings statistically to come out and all that stuff, and then it's very quickly turned around because I have to have this by Wednesday night or Thursday, because when I do the Nick Saban show Thursday, I'm staying in Tuscaloosa for the rest of the weekend if it's a home game, and B, I want to have this in front of me during that Saban show in case he talks about Joe Blow from Michigan, and I can say, yeah, Khaleke Hudson, he was a second team All Big Ten on last season, and here it is written down, and he's the number 1 tackler. That's what else I do defensively. In yellow, I will have number 1 T, number 5 T, number 10 T, the number 10 tackler on the ball club. And again, the statistics, like I did last week, like I showed you for the offense, here they're defensive statistics: 59 tackles, 3.5 sacks, 8 tackles for loss, a fumble caused, 5 quarterback hurries. So everything that's on the stat sheet is transferred to these charts, so I'm not sitting and shuffling papers on game day.
And you mentioned as well, when you're calling the game, you have that spot chart, of course, is a great resource, but when you're physically calling the game and you use the binoculars, just where do you watch the snap through the binoculars? When do you ever take the binoculars away? How do you really use that to help enhance your call?
I use the binoculars until it is clear what the play is. If it's a running play, I keep them up in my, on my face. I'll stay with them right until the end of the play. If it's clear it's going to be a passing play, well, as soon as the quarterback drops back to throw, I'll pull the binoculars down so I can see who's where and what's going on and who might be free and so on and so forth. Sometimes I will, more often than not, I'll double check myself, even though I do have a great spotter, as I mentioned in Butch. He'll point out who's deep on a kickoff. He'll point to the guy on the chart because, on these charts, I even have a section for returns. So, and he'll point to, all right, number 8, and he'll point to the far side of the field. And then he'll point to number 23, and he'll go like this, means he's to the near side vis-a-vis the press box. But I always double check. That's just the way I am. So I'll put the binoculars up and make sure I say 8 over there and 23 over here. And we do that more in certain games when you're playing Tennessee and they have those hard to read numbers and so on. But during a regular play, though, the binoculars are up for the entire play if it's a run, and for until the quarterback drops back on a passing play.
How much going into big games, national championship games, and you've had the chance to call a lot of big games in your Alabama football broadcasting career. Is it in the back of your mind that these calls, everything that you say is going to live forever? I feel like that's got to be a mental hurdle for a broadcaster going into a big game.
It's not so much a hurdle. And I do think about it on what will clearly be the biggest play of the day. If you can isolate that play. 2 seconds to go, Tennessee, trying to kick a field goal to upset Alabama. And I'm saying to myself, don't blow this, because this call is going to be played everywhere tomorrow, and it'll live in the Bryant Museum forever. And if it's a block by Alabama, which it was in the case of Terrence Cody a number of years ago, I make sure I don't yell and scream like a nut. We've all heard those calls on the air where the broadcaster is unintelligible and the hosts almost make fun of him. I don't want to be that guy. So I always remind myself, don't blow this, get it right. Then in the case of the win over Georgia in overtime, when Tua hit Devontae Smith, you didn't know that was going to be the play, but I just always remind myself, be calm, be cool, and I will raise my voice inflection and a little bit of extra volume. But if you listen, even go back and listen to that call, the volume was not crazy. It was voice inflection. And, you work on that. And again, that comes by experience. But no, I don't worry about the calls per se, unless it's an absolute, big, and you can isolate it. If this kid makes the kick, the game is over. Or if this is this or that is that, whatever. But, in the case of that Georgia game, you just went with it, and, you hope for the best. But I try not to yell and scream, but there's no question we're excited. But there's a difference between being excited, and as a matter of fact, I think I've told Roger this story, and I don't say this to pat myself on the back, but it was a very interesting call. The day after the Alabama-Georgia game, I got a phone call from a good friend of mine, Eric Hasseltine, who was the voice of the Memphis Grizzlies of the NBA. And he said, I got to tell you, every broadcaster needs to listen to your game-winning touchdown call. He said, and you did that magnificently. He said, I'll tell you, he said, if that was me, this is Eric talking, and he said, if it was the Grizz having just won the NBA championship on a guy chucking up the ball as soon as he crossed midcourt and it was nothing but net, he said, you wouldn't have been able to understand a word I was saying. He said, I would have been absolutely berserk on the air. He said, what you did last night should be a lesson for every broadcaster out there. So, and I was, that was very kind of him to say, but it was a good call in that respect. It was a huge moment, obviously, but everything we said and did was totally clear and understandable, though obviously very, very excited, but not out of control.
How long does it take you to get that inner calm? Because in the end, you are giving the information to the listener in the car. So if it's an incredible moment, and in a way you are rooting for Alabama, it's the Alabama Radio Network, but you have to make sure that you convey that in a way where it's digestible for the listener. So how long did it take to get to that point where, this is an incredible moment, the confetti's raining down, but I have to do my job and I still have to remain emotionally calm?
It's a great question. I can't tell you when it happened. I mean, it happened, in steps, I'm sure, over the course of these 30 some odd years. So to say that it happened 10 years in or 8 years in or 14 years in, I really don't know the answer to that. But I know I've always been very aware of it. And I've always felt for those guys on the air who just get, skewered by the guys on SportsCenter or Fox Sports and, listen to this call from yesterday. Yeah. Good Lord. And they make fun of the kid. And I just didn't want to be that guy that they made fun of. So I don't know if I can truly tell you, Kyle, it happened at this point. And it probably just developed, over the course of years. But, I mean, it had already been in place, when Bama played Texas in the national championship game at the Rose Bowl. It might have happened in the late 90s. I don't know. I'd really be guessing.
Mm-hmm. On this show, Eli, we haven't had many hockey broadcasters, and that's something that you've done for many years. It's what really brought you to Alabama many years ago. Kyle, have you done any hockey broadcasting?
Have not. Nobody wants to hear that.
I haven't either. So if Kyle or I were going to fill in for you on a Birmingham hockey game, what would you tell us is most important? And what would you tell young broadcasters trying to call hockey? What is most important on radio to have a successful hockey play-by-play call?
The biggest thing, and I get sent tapes all the time from young broadcasters. Would you mind taking a listen to this and critiquing my work? And I said, I'll be honored. Thank you. Send it on. The biggest thing is, pace yourself. Again, just because the puck is going 125 miles an hour doesn't mean you have to. And follow the puck. You will never get in trouble if you're following the puck. And I will tell young broadcasters, I had a young guy, I did a game, I forget, a year or so ago, and there was a kid from some minor league team had come up and asked if he could sit in the booth, and I said, sure. And the guy then sent me some of his work. And it was okay as far as the pacing and what have you, but you had no idea where the puck was. You had no idea where the puck was. And he didn't realize that. So I said to this young man, I said, here's what I want you to do. I said, I want you to put that tape on in your office. I want you to lean back in your chair, close your eyes, and listen and see if you can follow the puck. It's not enough to say, tips it over to Jones or, whatever. Where was Jones sitting or standing on the ice? He said, you tell me if you could truly follow the puck, not who had it, but where they were situated. He'll take a big blast. Well, did it come from the face-off circle? Was it from the blue line? Was he in the middle of the circles? Where was he? And the kid wrote me back shortly thereafter and said, my God, said, you have no idea where the puck was. I said, no, sir, I sure didn't. So that's the biggest thing. Follow the puck and describe. Again, going back to what I talked about earlier, you can never describe things too much. Where is the puck? At the face-off circle to the right of the goaltender. And periodically in my play-by-play, and it didn't matter if I was doing the NHL or minor league, and as the play was going, I said, all of this taking place to my right, to the near side of goaltender, Paul Mason. Because the fan at home visualizes us sitting at the center ice line, at the red line. And so when I say it's to my right, you can almost visualize your listeners' heads turning this way. And then I'll say, and here come the Predators. They break it out of the zone right to left and such. And you can almost visualize their heads listening, going like this. I want to place them in the arena. And the best way to do that is directionally. I talk about, and even in football, I talk about the far side and the near side. I don't usually use the short side of the field or the wide side. I will say, they're at the hash mark, the right side hash mark across the way, closest to the Tennessee bench. Or what I use directional references so people can, in their mind's eye, regardless of where we're sitting, whether we're at the 30, whether we're in the end zone, as far as the listener is concerned, I'm on the 50. And that's how I do it. And that's how you do it for hockey. Just follow the puck, but describe where it is, and don't get blown away by the speed of the game. And we talked about memorization. Now in hockey, you have to memorize the entire roster. Obviously, for both teams, they change as the play is ongoing. They jump on and off the ice, so you must have the full rosters memorized in hockey.
We've talked about some football plays, how you describe it, what's important with some different play calls and things like that. But what about atmosphere? Because atmosphere is one of the best things about college football, and you help make that alive before there's a kickoff, before Alabama runs on the field, or going to any of these great places where Alabama will play. What's most important to you in describing and capturing the atmosphere and then getting that onto the radio for the listeners?
I just describe exactly what I'm seeing and feeling. Again, I go back to being a professional describer. The colors, the sounds, the heat, the cold, the smell, the lights are on, the lights aren't on, the color of the sky, the emotion. Here come the cheerleaders, here come the officials walking out. There's nothing that happens that I don't describe. Nothing. Here are the captains coming out of the locker room, walking on the near sideline and the far sideline, getting ready to handle the toss of the coin. Nothing happens that I don't describe. I want those people who are listening to see it all in their mind's eye through my words. So the emotion is there. Normally, obviously, this year might be different. Who knows? But you've got a full stadium. You've got, the band is playing. You've got all of that. And I describe all of that. Here's the $1 Million Band marching out, 400 members strong. And, the tuba, section is doing this, that, and the other. There's nothing that is too small to be described. So that's what I do, and then we mix in the news and the information that we need to impart. But my job, my only job, is to take that listener, whether they're in the car, whether they're at work, whether they're in a hospital with no TV, whether they're who knows where they are. Maybe the game's on cable, and yes, believe it or not, there are people in this world who don't have cable TV. My job is to take them from where they are sitting and place them right on that midfield logo so they can feel all the emotion. Same thing in NASCAR. I always used to talk about the volcano of sound and speed. And, as the cars came by, and talk about the wind that would be generated by 43 cars going by at 200 miles an hour. And, just anything you can see or feel, you need to impart to the listener.
Verbiage for you. There's a million ways that you can describe somebody catching a pass or running the ball over right tackle. Do you keep a list, or do you think about that while you're doing the game at all?
Not at all. No list. I don't think about a lot of things during the game. But I describe how they did it. I was actually watching a tape the other day because I had to do something for the network. And it was a kickoff, and the ball bounced, and it was grabbed by the return man at the 2-yard line. And so I said, here's the kick. It's going to be short. It bounces at the 7, goes right to Waddle, who reaches behind and over his left shoulder to grab the football and start running it out. Well, behind and over his left shoulder is something I think is key, because it is a descriptive of what actually happened. I could have said, Waddle's got it on the one bounce, and but I will not say that. I will say, reaches over his left shoulder and makes the grab. Uh, things that I've learned from other broadcasters. So I overly prepare and I overly describe. But in radio, you can never really overly describe. People always say to me, why do you always describe the uniforms that they're wearing before the game? But we can see that. I said, well, I'm not broadcasting for your benefit. Yes, you can see that. You're there or you're watching the TV. I'm doing this for the number of letters we get from blind people, from military people in some godforsaken corner of the Bagram Air Force Base with no access to television, and they're listening. They can't see the colors of the uniforms. Why do I talk about, and the wide receiver comes wide left and his towel is bouncing off his left hip? Why do I say that? That's no big deal, but it's what's happening. And I'll say that. I will just describe it. If I saw it and it was enough to register with me, then I'll just let the listener know that here comes, Jerry Jeudy, wide left, the towel bouncing off his left hip as he takes his spot, because it's there. So the verbiage, obviously, and again, there are some things I say that others don't. Everybody has their pet calls. I don't really. I say touchdown Alabama, but that's a descriptive too. I don't really have an oh my like Mick Hubert in Florida or others like that. I just, I respect our audience to know what's going on and to be smart enough and to have their own emotions. My job is to bring that event to the person who is not there and let them interpret it as they want. And again, if it's a technical thing, well, that's why John Parker Wilson or Snake or Phil Savage or whomever is sitting beside me. So the verbiage to me is important and very important in when you're describing something.
Final one from me. On a normal college football Saturday or an NFL Sunday, say Alabama has a noon kickoff, how much are you listening to other broadcasters? You mentioned Kevin Harlan and things that you've gotten from him, but are you still listening and learning from other broadcasters around the country?
Sure, you always do. Oftentimes, we're on the air 3 hours before a game, and I've got other stuff to do prior to that, so I don't always get time on game day. But all of those games are replayed, they're archived somewhere, whether it's Sirius XM or on a network's website or what have you. Or you can, on Sunday, if I am or am not working, I'll watch NFL games and then I'll listen to Kevin Harlan while also watching, Monday Night Football. You're never too old to learn. You're never too, and if you think you can't learn, then there's some young kid out there who is learning, who's just waiting to take your job away from you. You can't get lazy. And there are days, I promise you, there are days when, and I don't want to point out a school in particular, but I guess I should. It's late in the season. You've had a great year, and you're stepping out of conference to play School X, one of those schools that obviously on paper has no chance of beating you, and you should win by 60. And you're sitting there and you're putting the old chart together, and you say to yourself, well, I'm not going to wait for that stat to come out. It's not going to be a factor. And chances are it's not going to be a factor, but son of a gun, something happens, and if you didn't have that stat and you needed it, you feel like garbage. And so you're staring at these stat sheets, and it's late in the season, and you're tired, and it's a game again that Bama ought to win by 50 or 60. You cannot allow yourself to get lazy. You cannot. And people always ask me, do you prepare? How different is it to prepare for a national championship game? It's not different at all. And I've done 8 of them. I prepare for that national championship game exactly the way I would prepare for Alabama and Western Carolina. It really, there is no difference. If you screwed up on the air, people are going to talk about it. It didn't matter if the opponent was Texas or Western Carolina. You've still screwed up. I try not to give myself the opportunity to screw up. So, that's the one thing about this business. It's fun. I've never, you work your butt off, but I've never worked a day in my life, if you know what I'm saying. I've worked my butt off, but I've never worked a day in my life because I'm excited to get out of bed and come to the office and prepare for the next broadcast. And even if there is some tedium in there, preparing my notes, preparing the bios, doing all this, that, and the other, it's still, it's still a great way to make a living, and I won't risk getting lazy and losing that way to make a living.
That was very well said. And as we start to wrap things up, Eli, the target audience for this show is college students who are starting to learn about broadcasting. That's why we talk so much broadcast theory and the process of preparation, things like that. But either college students, high school students who may have an interest in broadcasting but don't know the first steps to take. Just if we could have you kind of as a commencement speaker and you could give just a few nuggets of some things they should do to really jumpstart their careers, what would it be?
That's a great question. The first thing is, it's no different than being the quarterback or being a NASCAR driver. You can't replicate getting those reps. You can't replicate getting that repetition in practice. I can't tell you how many times, and I say this not to drop names, but Bob Costas is a dear friend. We knew each other as kids. When we were together in Syracuse, New York, doing hockey, I was doing minor league hockey for the Long Island team. He was doing the Syracuse Blazers of the Eastern Hockey League back decades ago. He met me at the Hotel Syracuse. That's where we stayed, and we were going to lunch. And as he and I walked to lunch, we were doing the play-by-play of the two of us walking down the street. I'm serious. There they come upon the fire hydrant. Gold goes to the right, Costas to the left. We would just describe anything. We would see kids playing a pickup game, and I would do this all the time. I'd see kids playing a pickup basketball game on a schoolyard. I had no idea who the heck they were. I would just stand there and do the play-by-play. It didn't matter. I wasn't doing it to be factual as to, well, I don't know, is that Johnson or is that Jones? I don't know these kids. I made up names, but I was working on my descriptive skills. Jones over to Johnson, dribbles, penetrates, whatever it is. I used to go to ball games. If you're a kid now, go to your high school basketball games, go to your high school baseball games, sit as far out in the outfield, away from everybody, so you don't feel like a goober. Because, I did that when I was a kid. I went to Yankee Stadium almost every day. You could get into Yankee Stadium in those days for 60 cents. I understand things are different. But even to this day, you can go to the University of Alabama ball games, women's hoops. You can go sit in the far reaches of Coleman Coliseum, practice into your tape recorder, into your MP3 player, into your iPhone. Practice your play-by-play. Again, it doesn't matter. I would sit so many times in the outfield at Yankee Stadium doing the play-by-play, just making stuff up, but calling the ball as it was in action. Chambliss bounces it to third. Jones has it onto Johnson at second for one, onto first, a double play. Well, it might not have been Chambliss, not have been Jones or Johnson, but I was describing. I was learning how to describe things as they happened. Go to your school's high school or college baseball, softball, men's or women's hoops. Sit far away so you don't feel self-conscious, and just get those repetitions in. There's no substitute for reps. And that's my very first thing I would instruct them. And I would also tell you never to pass up on a radio job for television. Radio makes you a far better broadcaster. Radio allows you to learn how to ad lib, how to think on your feet. You're not just sitting there reading off a teleprompter. Radio, the greatest broadcasters of this day, all started on radio. All of them. You name them, they started on radio. Whoever you think the best is, they started on radio. And yes, TV pays more. I understand that. But, 45 seconds on camera at the start, maybe a minute, in the middle of the fifth inning, and maybe a post-game on-camera hit. I know people like to have their puss on the tube, but it's not worth that. It's never worth that to turn down a good job. If you get a radio job to do play-by-play or to be a studio host or whatever it is you want to do, don't say no to radio. Radio is the greatest training ground that this business has. So those are just a few little tips right there.
Well, that's really good, and that's exactly what we were looking for, and you've been someone that's helped my career a lot, and I know you've shared a lot of wisdom that's helped a lot of young broadcasters, so we just thank you for this past hour, because who knows the next careers you're going to influence from some of the lessons we learned today, so just thank you, Eli.
I hope so. It's a great way to make a living. It's a fun way to make a living. It does take a lot of work, but I'm happy to help out, because I did the same thing when I was a kid. I wrote to all sorts of broadcasters. I wrote to everybody. I pestered everybody. Not that you've been pestering me, but I pestered everybody. Some answered, some did not. But I'll never forget the advice from those who were kind enough to give advice.
Thanks, Eli.
My pleasure, guys.
All right. Thanks to Eli Gold. We'll be back with you next week for another edition of Broadcaster Hour. See you, everyone.